Today, I'm excited to talk about how scenario planning improves the PPBE process. This was an area we explored at the ASMC Data and Analytics Conference, and it has only grown in importance since then as budget reform continues to be a major DoD initiative. While we believe reform is necessary, we also want to focus on the ways to improve outcomes within today's approach. Today, I'll start with who Decision Lens is and why we're tackling this topic. We'll then move on to making the case for scenario planning. This will be followed by real-world examples of how some of our customers are scenario planning with Decision Lens to develop a more agile, responsive fiscal strategy. We'll even show a demo of the software and how it's being used. Finally, we'll talk about how you get started with scenario planning. Okay, let's start with why Decision Lens is discussing scenario planning. Decision Lens is dedicated to modernizing how government prioritizes plans and funds. So when an organization is looking to mature its planning and budgeting capabilities to be more agile and mission aligned, they come to Decision Lens. As a SaaS company, we develop solutions which deliver the capabilities that you and your team can then use to advance your mission. We've been doing this for a while, since 2005. We have a top secret security clearance, are FedRAMP certified, and offer a variety of contract vehicles available to simplify procurement. We're also investing in more hosting options. Most recently, we announced a partnership with Second Front and Advana to increase availability of our software to higher IL levels. I can't tell you how often we've been asked about making Decision Lens more available. Because we're exclusively public sector focused, we invest a lot of time and energy at this effort, and we're making significant progress. So why does scenario planning matter? Because the US needs to reform the PPBE process as soon as possible. Several months ago, we published a report titled The 6 Guiding Principles of a Next Generation Defense Budget System. The report leveraged subject matter experts, a ton of third-party research, and first-person interviews. The report identified 5 key challenges, as you can see listed on the slide. In another presentation, we discussed how manual processes turn analysts into glorified data validators, preventing them from doing strategic data analysis. But today, the 2 issues that we really want to focus on are the fact that the current system is very rigid, and we can see this manifest in the right ways, whether it's the reprogramming of funds, whether it's 5-year POM planning, or why allocating colors of money is really difficult. We hear from our customers and even our prospects that moving money around as the world changes is too difficult, especially in a dynamic world. And the second piece of that is how it prevents strategic alignment. This is a problem when something happens in the world and your mission changes. How easy or difficult is it for you to then reallocate funds and change around the order of priorities to address the fact that you have a new objective? I'm sure you experience this on the front lines as you try to resource the mission when you rely on antiquated tools and antiquated processes which require manual intervention time and time again. By addressing these shortcomings in the PPBE process, we can spend money more effectively. We can spend it more efficiently, and we can make decisions faster to ultimately help accelerate and advance ahead of our near-peer adversaries. Just one more thing before we dive into scenario planning, and that is defining the term. Much like AI or ML, the words are really loaded, words that could mean anything to anybody. It's important we are on the same page as to how we define scenario planning. We define scenario planning in the following way. Scenario planning enables individuals to prepare for and respond dynamically to an unknown future. It provides insight in advance about the many ways the future may unfold and how you can be responsive, resilient, and effective as that version of the future becomes reality. Basically, scenario planning allows you to develop a variety of future states so you know if A, then B, then C, then D, but a lot more complex than what's possible in Excel or PowerPoint or on a whiteboard. These are not good solutions for simple scenario planning and are woefully inadequate for complicated situations. There are 4 key elements to consider. Number 1, and this is on a scale, are very advanced organizations who are asking how to add artificial intelligence to plan for tens of thousands of potential scenarios and tell them what the optimal approach would be, right? That's the end state for organizations to evolve into over time. Second is the ability to change several variables and see the impact of what that changing environment will look like without changing your plans. This allows you to create what if plans to comparing multiple options. So when you go into a meeting and you need to present various opportunities for what the future could look like, you can quickly show how it is different than the way the world looks today. Finally, we come to probably the most unheralded component of this. It's custom criteria. So these are dependencies and must fund constraints. Your commanding officer saying we're doing this. You've got to be able to walk it into place. You have to be able to create your own metadata and other information that says this is the way we're going to approach this. This is the way we're going to look at this. I'd imagine that most listeners have a different approach and different set of criteria in which they're going to evaluate success. So you need to have the control over the scenario to meet the needs of your individual mission using your criteria to meet your objective. All right, so let's leave the world of the theoretical and talk about how scenario planning manifests in the real world. I'd like to share 3 examples. I want to start with number 1. Your project isn't ready to start on time. So the project isn't ready to start on time is one customer's face all the time, specifically around either the allocation of people. So we had the people ready to start, but for some reason, the project itself cannot start, or money even more specifically, especially in an environment where they're dealing with funds that maybe have an expiration. So imagine a scenario where you were going to allocate funds to, or requirement A or project A, specific funds, or I don't know, let's say RDT and E funds. They have a shelf life to them, and now that project can't start and consume those funds. Therefore, you run the scenario where funding needs to kind of either be reshuffled, or you need to explore another option because the clock is ticking on those funds. That's one example of how we help your organization succeed when a project isn't ready to kind of start on time option. The have more money probably is not as likely as losing budget, but in the demo in a minute, in theory, we have money available. And that's because in my scenario, things were under burning. So I'm going to step through unfunded requirement drill where there actually is extra money, but generally things are under burning less often than over burning. When that happens, you have less money. The customers that we serve experience a budget cut, which turns into drill when you must take cuts. It's important not only to see what would come on or off the table. So like I was going to do 15 things and I can only do 12. Or can I just divert some of them in time and maybe do those later? Then you can report to leadership and say, ma'am, this would be the impact of tabling this or that, or we push them over in time. This is a very complex type of problem to solve in an area where we actually help quite a bit. The third example is also interesting. The government doesn't sell products, right? They work in certain service branches that the soldiers, airmen, guardians, and such. And because that landscape and environment constantly changes, the theory would be that the way where we put our money in the things we start to pursue should stay kind of locked up and not drag behind those that we're supporting in the field. And therefore, when the types of orders we might be battling change, or other environments where you can't really have that investment lag behind. So you must figure out, well, what are we going to do next? At this point, you're just playing catch up, but you're never really getting ahead. So you'll see that a little bit in my demonstration, how the thing is that you then might need to adjust and build scenarios around that. So those are at least 3 examples. There are far more that we help with other organizations. All right, so let's get down to kind of brass tacks here in terms of how DoD customers are using scenario planning. One of the challenges I expect you'll face is that getting to scenario planning can seem very arduous or so far away that you just don't know where to start with it. What we've seen is that the best and most successful ways to implement a solution like scenario planning is to start small. What we typically suggest is starting on the requirements planning capability side of the equation, which includes things like, how do you improve your collection of requests, right? How do you move from the episodic to an ongoing basis where you're constantly getting information with relevant metadata so you can track, analyze the results, and rank against your mission? You can even validate that data to determine the efficacy of the information you collected, and then ultimately prioritize that data. And a lot of what we talk about really starts with the level of prioritization that it's absolutely critical to understanding what you're going to fund and what you're not going to fund to as things change, right? This is where all resource constrained prioritization is critical. So think about that as like unfunded requirements, which are a subset of an existing portfolio. The reason that we typically start there with our customers is the data is usually pretty well understood and they can get their arms around it more effectively. And yes, it may take, several months. You can see that we have listed that this may take 3 months to organize your data, create a collection process stored in one central location. Then once you get that all sorted out and get comfortable with it, you can blow it out to your broader budget and requirements. So it's not just about your unfunded requirements, it's about your entire year and your entire next year. And then once you get to those pieces, and you again must implement collection and validation of prioritization across that as well, you can move to the right side of the equation, which is resource allocation. The focus there right now is scenario planning. So budget planning and spend plan are things that sometimes come after scenario planning, but sometimes feed into it. But it's really about taking the information that you've prioritized in requirements planning and then creating scenario plans on top of that. And again, talking about it is a lot harder than just showing it, which I'll do shortly. But the idea is that you're able to analyze multiple scenarios, potentially using algorithms to understand optimal performance. While you may start at a microscopic level within a wing or unit, as you get that information rolled up to more parent organizations to deliver more value and broader alignment, having your data organized and collated and collected, and hopefully using the same framework, makes it a lot easier to figure out where money should flow and where money should come from. So usually we see senior leaders coming in and saying, well, we've got all these disparate elements and we need to find a way to organize them, structure them so we can rework our processes. At the end of the day, they were able to do these data calls much faster and provide a lot more value. You no longer are showing up in the meeting and saying, well, let me go run the data again. You're running that data in real time, presenting your findings, and get moving from that data validation to that data analysis like we talked about in the last meeting that we have together. Okay, now I wanted to highlight 3 example customers that range across the spectrum of maturity. Let's start with one of our Army customers. They are using Decision Lens across many of their centers of excellence to scoring projects and make decisions. They use what-if planning to evaluate new and emerging requirements. What can they find? What do they have to fund? What if they get less money than they were expecting? Kind of that classic scenario that we described earlier. I'm going to move over to one of our Air Force customers. They are earlier in their development because they are a newer customer. Their desire for us and their desire is to move to a more standard unfunded requirements prioritization, right? Again, on that slide we just looked at, it's that kind of subset of data, and they're getting there. They're making process progress, but their goal is to make decisions on what unfunded requirements or programs to fund by going to Decision Lens to compare their requests to the actual budget and present options of things that can be done. So again, you go from the sitting there trying to pull the data to having a proactive fiscal strategy, which we know that the DoD is really focused on. Now we'll talk about a Navy customer. They're using Decision Lens for a portfolio to gather their cost savings with the goal of meeting their mission, which includes focusing on affordability, capability, and availability, all while maintaining readiness and cutting costs. One can imagine how important it is for them to understand what costs are cut and how to use that money. So they take that portfolio, they then use our what-if analysis and prioritization framework. Note that frameworks are important to this and help them make decisions on what unfunded requirements to fund. So they're using what-if plans, they're using prioritization, they're using the framework to really come up with this data-driven solution to what to do next and how to fund it. Again, a range of customer examples across a range of maturity, but all moving towards that scenario planning model, where analysts can provide insight and guidance to what to do next versus having to spend more time collecting and organizing that data. Okay, now I'm going to pass off the presentation to one of my colleagues for a demo of Decision Lens.
All right, so we're going to switch gears here and show you the software. We're going to start here because when users start with Decision Lens, they are very eager to get into the scenario planning, and there's a tendency to overlook this foundational piece of really getting a handle on that data. We recently had a client who was just like, I want to do scenario planning. Let's do scenario planning. Here's all the business rules. We have to cut this type. And don't take any cut more than 10% of an overall portfolio. Do this, do that. And I was trying to explain to those individuals, how are you doing things like characterizing the benefit or impact if not funded, and so on and so forth. Initially, they were confused about my question because data-driven prioritization is hard. I pressed them on their business rules. What happens when there are still more things in your list that need to be cut? Do we cut the first and the third one? Do we cut the first and the fifth one? And that was the aha moment. They're like, oh, we don't really have a way to kind of explore that trade space. So that's why I'm starting with this piece here. The framework actually allows you to start think about the decision space that you're actually going to explore moving forward. So in my example, it's going to be unfunded requirements, because that's a relatable example. Okay, if I'm going to start looking at unfunded requirements in the beginning of the year to the tail end of the year when the fiscal year is writing down, what is the type of data that I'm going to use in support of analysis? I might conduct analysis that could take shape in many different ways. I know I have everything populated here, but it's very nimble, such that it could be configured to accommodate the way that you would scenario plan. But the bottom line is, in my example, there are some performance objectives that I'm trying to plan for, or at least when I pick my unfriend requirements, I'm trying to maximize. They could be things like alignment to the strategic plan, the breadth of that impact that that requirement might have, its impact on organizational readiness. These are things I'm either trying to maximize or pursue or achieve in the funds that I'm spending. There are also things that constrain me from picking up all my unfunded requirements. You'll see in my example that I'm going to have only our R, D, T, and E money to spend. So I can't pick unfunded requirements that use other funds. How can I start to layer in the types of funds that I could use to pursue some of these benefits I want out of my unfunded requirements? And then for those organizations that are looking at something like risk, I'll kind of pause here. But just with this bucket is things that are uncertainty. You hear it's execution risk and technical risk, but things that are essentially trying to minimize when I'm actually starting to pick up some of those unfunded requirements, especially because I'm the tail end in my example of the fiscal year. So the point is, this problem space is far more complex than just matching up the number. In a past role, some goals were just to make the numbers work, and I was pretty good at making the numbers fit. And then that started to progress. Was I reported directly to a general, as he would say, okay, so if we do this, then what impact does that have on our force protection, or what impact does that have on reducing soldier burden? That what? Like, I'm not even tying these things to that. And then he's like, well, what are we doing? And it's like, well, sir, we were just making the numbers fit. And he just like looks at you like, wait, what? So then we started to actually selling subsequently. The point is, then we started to build out a structure to support the type of analysis that we're trying to get done. And that's really all this kind of framework gets to. The point then becomes that when you get to start to bring in my example, the requirements, I'm going to start to look at and all the supporting information against that framework. You can see a lot of these things are mapped in here that you saw earlier. Alignment to strategic plan of impact readiness. These are all the pieces of data that I want to use to support the analysis I want to conduct. And this is an Excel normal. When I interact with organizations from the start, this almost always comes in Excel. And there's a couple different problems with Excel. I was a user of Excel, and I already explained to you my attitude back that Excel was great. But what I found was that this type of scenario planning, especially because unfunded requirements was an area of expertise, helped my career a great deal. I never had to get ready. I always stayed ready. I always kind of anticipated funds that might become available, what I would do, what I wouldn't be able to do, who could execute, and things like that. Initially, I feared that if I told the general that I needed software, he would think I wasn't good at my job. And therefore, I should just use the Office suite that I've been given out and solely be able to function with Excel. But I think the problem that I ran into was I had to become my own developer. And if I got ill, or if I wasn't at work, or I was collaborating, and being able to leave a trail for why decisions were made right, because the theory would be you make a decision, you've seen the outcome of that, you learn from that, and then you build that into the next way you make. In this example, I'm trying to requirements decisions moving forward. So it becomes very difficult to fold in the outcomes of the investments that you made and then therefore learn in an Excel environment. Really what it ends up becoming is just that I would make numbers then, and second, someone would ask, did you contemplate all possible options? What else did you consider? And I would think to myself, I'm like, you know how long it took me to find just one option, like all day? Like it took me all day to figure out how to make either the numbers spent from the schedule or how to maximize force protection, right? Reducing soldier burning. I couldn't find another option. I just found one that worked, and then I tried to sell that up the chain. And I think that was also the kind of attitude shift that had to be adjusted. Was it's okay to look for pieces of technology to kind of make me seem bigger than I am. Like, hey, I'm a one-person team now. I seem like I'm a four-person team because I'm using technology. And also I was able to give him far better recommendations and better and more clearly be able to articulate the impacts or implications of doing so. And that's how I was able to kind of traverse those grades kind of so quickly. So groups should not be afraid to offload the Excel, even though this kind of looks like Excel, because that's kind of the point behind it. They should look at it as an opportunity to evolve the way they make decisions, give leadership a better options, and then be able to more clearly communicate what those actions options are and the implications of doing so. Now let's transition to prioritizing. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a place where you kind of pull over, you get gas, but this isn't your destination. And the destination will be, where do I put my money, right? And that should align to the things that are most important to you. And that's what really this actually gets at, is how could you start to characterize things like benefit or value or other things that you want to use as a mechanism to prioritize where the funds go. So I've layered in just a couple requirements here to show in this example. They could be consumed or looked at. I could bring in as many columns of data that I want. I'm just looking at functional area so I can understand which requirements are tied to what functional area as I step through my scenarios. And then for those that saw that framework slide or screen, you could see the factors that I'm using to help characterize in my example the value that each one of these requirements would have. So that could be things like strategic plan, present impact, organizational readiness, so on and so forth. This is something that you can customize to how you actually want to make these decisions. You could also layer in things like level of influence. So all of these things are important, but they're not necessarily equally important. And how does accounting for those nuances along with people's judgments able to best characterize the priority that each of these requirements would have? So the point I mentioned earlier would staying kind of lockstep with the organization is specifically around that scenario. Three I mentioned earlier, looking at impact on enabling the force. Look at how that could actually reshuffle the things I might look at. I could very quickly slide this out and say I want this to really contribute pretty heavily to how this prioritized list kind of shakes out. And if I do that, what does that new list look like? And this is something that I used very heavily. When I used Excel to reshuffle the kind of the ordered list, and I often would have to take actions, or if I had to fold in a fixed metric, so I would sit with the general and I'd show him what we were doing. He would say, what happens if we want to fold in this metric? I would say, sir, I have to take an action and I'll come back to you. No sooner that I came back to that meeting, there would be something else that he wanted to fold in, and yet I'm still not prepared. And then I must go back again and again and get back on his calendar. And this wasn't my only job, right? As I mentioned, prioritizing is just going to be a mechanism to support scenario planning. He doesn't do scenarios, so you can't sit here forever. Like, you could sit here for a little bit to make sure you're comfortable with whatever selection strategy you're going to use to support those scenarios. But you got to move on at some point. And this is pretty critical in terms of being able to kind of navigate through that. So now I characterize value and fold it in the requisite data that I need. Now I'm starting to explore some of the scenarios I might want to play out. This is a very basic example here. I had $13.7 million that was under burning, so I yanked it away from those things that weren't spending it. And now I want to look at requirements that could even pull from that funding. Just remember, some of the metrics that I was using for us have impact, which is just subjective. Organizational readiness is a number risk, are these star things. It's very hard to reconcile that to say, well, this one's moderate and this is a 48.5 and this is long-term case. That better than something that's slight, 66 long-term, 3 stars and 3. Like, that's the point I'm getting at. It's like very difficult now with all this extra data available. It's created a new problem, and that new problem is sorting through it and being able to reconcile it and get to some discernible types of things you might pursue. So the point is, you could start to create scenarios where maybe you want to prove value that could differentiate from, let's say, trying to reduce risk, and therefore the things you might look at would change. And then you're able to create scenarios that explore those different options and now start to compare and contrast them against this common framework and common set of metrics to understand the implications of doing so. And you can see that pretty crystal clear here. And I could still put my money towards 16 things in each plan, but the outcomes will be different. So this one has more value. It's hitting more of my performance objectives, but I'm taking on more risk. This plan is leaving a little bit of value at the table, but a little bit better at risk. And the point is, this could be then configured, so allow you to explore the pros and cons of each. So go to leadership and say, sir, ma'am, if I went left, here's the implications of doing so. If I go right, here's the implications of doing so. I think if we have to absorb that cut, we should look at going left, or if we have to pick up that $13.7 million of expiring funds and figure out what to do with it. This seems to be a better option, and that's where we help organizations move to, and that's what I wanted to show you.
Thanks for that demo. Now, I don't want to get into too much detail on this slide because we covered a good bit of it during the demo, but I wanted to remind you that setting up a framework is really important. Even without new technology, you can work on establishing an analytical framework. Understanding the value metrics and all the other factors are really important, that we can share some more details on what a value, cost, risk, and balance framework looks like. But no, ultimately that's something that is a business decision more than anything else. So understanding how you want to analyze your challenges and overcome them as a critical first step, and you can start doing that right now. All right, so what do you need for the foundations for success? We obviously just mentioned having the framework is really important. You have to focus on data management. This is the unsexy, not so fun stuff that is critical for success. You have to make sure your data is accurate and structured so it can be updated and available in real time. This is absolutely essential, and we know that there are challenges connecting systems of record. But finding ways to get as close to that system of record as possible is really important. Collecting data on an ongoing basis is part of this. Don't forget that understanding your systems means understanding all of the elements. So we just say focus on learning your data processes. Find ways to optimize the structure. How do you apply things like the VCRB framework, or all elements that are important? And then you need to really invest in analytical tools, because Excel, if not fit for purpose, I love Excel. I use it for a lot of things, but if you make a mistake, there's no audit trail. If you are sick one day, someone can't access your file or understand what happens. If you want to understand why a decision was made, you have difficulty in sharing that information because it's just not designed for sophisticated scenario planning. The next point is unsurprisingly important. You really do need to find ways to motivate your organization and make investments in the tools that you determine are useful. Note that early adopters and innovators represent less than 13% of workers. So we need more people like that at the federal level and in general to drive organizational behavior forward. And while it may not directly affect your individual job or maybe your individual role within your organization, it does when looking at the bigger picture of delivering to the mission. That's what it allows you to do, right? The handoff between people is smoother and aids a higher level understanding of what's going on is more important. And the only way to do that is with proper tools. So consuming and understanding data requires visualization. You saw how I showed you some custom integrations and visualizations that are within our platform. You can also use BI tools to go and look at your data, but I really must stress that you must understand that Microsoft Office is not fit for this purpose. Then ultimately, with these elements in place, financial managers can begin analyzing data and providing guidance based on their expertise. So kind of all goes back to how do you move from being a data validator to a data analyst and eventually the leader of your organization. So we have a couple of benefits included for what scenario planning offers. First, you get to expedite scenario planning. You don't have to live in Excel for hours or days at a time. You can justify decisions and conduct what-if analysis to demonstrate the performance of alternative scenarios. This is also critical when you're thinking about being audited. You're dealing with audit situations and not audit like big audit. But if people are coming back and saying, why was this decision made? Who made this decision? What was the purpose of this decision? In Decision Lens, everything is recorded. You have a record of all things that were made. You could make notes and adaptations as you're making decisions. So there is an ongoing record of every decision made, whether you're still in the organization or you left 10 years ago. Scenario planning lets you adapt to change and update requirements quickly by understanding the impact of shifting priorities. This was the crux of the demo earlier. The ultimate outcome is you create a continuous, proactive approach to planning. This is essential. As we've seen, the world is changing faster and faster. We're not living in an environment of the 1960s when the PPBE process really kind of generated in full form and became the way that we plan, program, and budget. We are in a different world, and we must be able to respond more quickly. We want to optimize budget performance. So you don't want to be left with money at the end of the year that you have to spend on, items that don't meet the mission, and then ultimately you can improve your budget planning for future years. So many times programs get some small percentage of what they expect. You have to be ready to react and ready to respond by anticipating change in advance to afford yourself and the team greater agility. In closing, we know the DoD has to move away from a simple bang for buck optimization and extend it to more consideration to value, impact, cost, risk. Only then can you put your money where your mission is. If you'd like to learn more about how Decision Lens can help your organization, you can request a custom demo by sending an email to sales@decisionlens.com or visit our website for our latest thought leadership content. Thanks for listening and have a great day.